We are proud to be working with Ferry Ales Brewery, who are a Lincoln-based company that brew award-winning craft ales and lagers to perfection so you can enjoy them again and again. They have an amazing range of aviation-themed ales and have also worked with some frontline RAF squadrons to provide them with top-quality ales and beers, so if you're an Av geek and beer fan like myself, you're in luck. They come in a case of 12 500ml bottles that are delivered right to your door, and you can get 5% off your order with code AIRCREW225, so just head to their website ferryalesbrewery.co.uk to pick up yours and browse all their other products. Thank you and enjoy. And yeah, I'm also here to talk about being a test pilot. How did this come about?
Yeah, so it came about initially, I was going to say a bit by accident. It happened earlier than I intended it to. So I was coming to the end of my tour on 74 Squadron, having flown the Phantom in the UK and the Falkland Islands primarily, but also various other places, but primarily operationally in the UK and the Falkland Islands. And this is going to sound really daft, Mike, really daft, but I was getting bored with it. Now, how could you get bored with being a fighter pilot? How could you get, I don't know. I mean, even saying it out loud now sounds ridiculous.
A lot of viewers would be like, oh my God, really?
But I was, yes, and I was thinking, what next? And I'd done a physics degree, and I kind of wanted to be able to use that in some way, and it seemed to me that being a test pilot would combine a bit of kind of science and engineering with flying aeroplanes. And therefore I looked into how do you become a test pilot, found out you have to go and do this ridiculous year-long course and that you have to apply for it. So I bullied my flight commander and my boss on 74 Squadron, who at the time would have been Martin Routledge, who was my flight commander, just a great guy. And the boss was the legendary Cliff Spink, who's obviously still flying Warbirds.
I've interviewed him before, yes.
Have you?
Yes.
Yeah. So Cliff, just brilliant. So I had a chat with them both and convinced them that they should support my application to be a test pilot. And they said two things. First of all, they said, that'll be the end of your career, because anybody that goes into the test flying world won't get promoted. You'll stay as a flight lieutenant, you might make squadron leader, you'll end up leaving and joining industry. That's what they said, so they were wrong, because I eventually made Air Commodore, so there you go, Cliff Spink, you were wrong. Although he did a lot better than me, I have to say. And the other thing they said is it's too early in your career. So they like to take people with 2 operational frontline tours before they go into test pilot training. Right. And although my tour had been a long one, I'd actually only done 1 operational tour. So I went to Boscombe Down to do the selection process, not expecting to get in. The best I was hoping for was come back in a couple of years when you've got a bit more operational experience. But the exams went well, the interviews, which were really scary, went well, and to my utter amazement, they offered me a place to start the course the following year. So it was a bit of a dream come true, but I was still a bit nervous about it because it was still a couple of years earlier than I'd really intended to do it.
Was there much competition there?
There's quite a bit. Yeah, there was quite a lot. The Air Force in those days was still quite big. So I think we're still talking about over 100,000 people in the Air Force. I can't remember how many frontline operational squadrons, but a lot compared to the Air Force of today. And of course there were only 2 or 3 fast jet slots a year at ETPS. So yes, there was quite a lot of competition. I think one of the other guys who went through selection with me that year was Frank Chapman, who is now with Airbus and has been with Airbus for many years. And I think I'm right in saying Frank went through the same selection as me. Maybe also Mark Bowman, certainly around the same time, and Mark ended up and still is with BAE Systems, of course.
So can you actually tell us the role of a test pilot?
Yeah, so people often wonder about that. Why do we still need test pilots? Because there's obviously not that many new aircraft coming through these days, and obviously the kind of archetypal job of a test pilot is testing new aeroplanes. I guess I'd sum the role of a test pilot up in you're looking after the user, you're looking after the consumer, and particularly in commercial aircraft, you're looking after the passenger and you're looking after people on the ground. So classically, I guess there's 3 questions as a test pilot that you're interested in answering. The first is it safe? The second is, can it do the job? And the third is, does it meet the required specifications? So if you boil it down, those are the three questions you're trying to answer, whether it's a whole aircraft or whether it's a system or a subsystem that's been fitted to an existing aircraft. Any time you make a change to an aeroplane and you change the airworthiness, or you put a new piece of equipment in, a new system, something like that, somebody's got to go and assess it, figure out if it works, figure out if it's safe, and figure out if it meets the millions of regulations that it's supposed to meet.
And can you talk us through some of your initial training, and how did it differ, coming from a frontline squadron?
Yeah, so the biggest thing, I guess, is getting used to flying lots of different types of aircraft. So, when you're on a squadron, you know the aircraft you're flying inside out. You're an absolute expert on it. Things like checklists, normal checklists, emergency checklists, you could recite them in your sleep, and you know them off by heart. As soon as you start jumping from one aircraft into another, you can't do that anymore. And trying to get out the habit as an operational fighter pilot of not learning checks is a really quite a hard habit to get out of. You've got to get used to using checklists, and you've got to be good at using checklists and quite fast at using them accurately. And I still teach at the test pilot school now, part-time, which is great fun to go back and do that. And one of the things I say to the guys and girls on the test pilot school is, by the end of the year, you'll be good at being able to fly an aeroplane that you don't know safely. And part of that is, what do I really need to know about this aircraft? What do I really have to have at the front of my mind? So time critical things like if an engine stops on takeoff, you need to jump on it pretty quick. So you need to know that. If you depart from controlled flight, what's the out of control recovery? You need to know that. So there are a number of things, but a relatively small number of things for each aircraft type that you fly that you need to figure out. What do I actually need to know about this aircraft, and commit it to memory? So Dave, can you talk us through some of the types you actually tested while you were on your course? Yeah, so on the course, the core of the course is, if I'm honest, the core of the course is teaching how to go from someone's opinion as an experienced operator to an absolutely watertight argument that you could walk into a meeting with a company or with the project team at Abbey Wood and win an argument. So you'll never win an argument on why something needs to be better based on opinion. You never will, because someone else will have a different opinion. But if you can fly an aircraft and assess an aircraft or a system or something and say, from my experience as a pilot, I believe that this is bad because, and then you've got a whole box of tools in terms of test techniques that you can dive into, where you can go from your opinion to an actual quantifiable set of numbers that prove why your opinion is right, and then you can communicate that. So you go from, I did this, I found it hard because this, and this. These are the implications for an operational pilot, therefore you need to fix it. So the course is all about teaching people how to build those watertight arguments to get people to spend money to fix things before things hit the front line. So very logical, Very logical, and it's all about building an argument and communication. Whether it's oral communication or whether it's written communication, that's the kind of core of the course. Now, that of course requires an understanding of engineering, aerodynamics, test techniques, all those kind of boring things, and that's why it's a year-long course. But the fun bit of the course is just getting your hands on lots of different airplanes. So, I mean, that's the fun bit, and that's almost a kind of byproduct, but that's the fun bit. So, I was very lucky when I went through the school. The school had a very, very diverse fleet of aircraft, going from the old Beagle Bassett with the wacky Cranfield analog computer in the back that made it fly differently, all the way through to a Tornado F2, which unfortunately, the year I went through the school was the first year the school had a Tornado. Before that, it had a Lightning. And because I'd always wanted to fly a Lightning and never did, I was really upset at missing the Lightning. But anyway, so it had all sorts of interesting aeroplanes to fly, but then also the school got lots of aircraft in. So just all sorts of interesting aeroplanes that came in. And then later in my career, when I instructed at the school, we always made an effort as instructors to get lots of different interesting aeroplanes in, just to broaden people's flying career, because when a lot of people go through test pilot school, they've really only flown one or two aircraft types, and when you pop out at the end with test pilot tattooed on your forehead, people expect you to be able to fly anything. So part of the course has got to be exposing people to flying lots of different aircraft. So everything from, we always got a DC-3 in. We always got a DC-3 from Coventry for the guys to go and fly. Multi-engine, relatively large tail dragger. I mean, what a fantastic aircraft to fly. And when I was the boss at the school, I always made it my job to go to Coventry and pick the DC-3 up, because that was just great fun. But then we always did a gliding module on the course, so we always got people into gliders. We always brought in some microlights. So 3-axis microlights and weight shift microlights, which is an eye-opener to people who've never flown. Everything's backwards. Everything's backwards. You push to go up, you pull to go down. The steering on the ground is like a go-kart, not like an aeroplane, so that's all back to front as well. So really very interesting to get your mind around a completely different control strategy. So all sorts of interesting aeroplanes were brought in. Pit Special, Extra 300, all sorts of interesting aircraft brought in for people to fly for the course.
You had some great paint schemes. Was it Raspberry Ripple, like all the Jags?
Yeah, the Raspberry Ripple, yeah, and that was kind of the old Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment colours, which Boscombe Down was still called A&AE or A squared E squared when I went through test pilot school, and then later you'll be aware it transitioned. So it went from that to being part of the Defence Research Agency. Then it became the Defence Evaluation and Research Agency, which was a trading fund and operated like a business. And that was a halfway house prior to the formation of Kinetic, which was about 2001, I think I'm right in saying, which was essentially the privatisation of DERA.
Yeah. So did you work directly with the frontline guys?
We did sometimes we did, sometimes we didn't. So some of the trials we did, we worked directly with the frontline guys. One that springs to mind was I was on Fast Jet Test Squadron, or Fixed Wing Test Squadron as it was called actually in those days, during the first Gulf War. And that was a very, very busy period on the squadron, as you can imagine. All sorts of work to do on all sorts of aircraft, but particularly a lot of work to do on the Tornado GR1 and on the Tornado F3. And one of the things that we did for Gulf War I was clearing a thing called the AR5 respirator for use in the Gulf. The AR5 was the aircrew nuclear, biological and chemical respirator, so allowing you to continue to operate the aircraft in NBC type conditions. Anybody that's flown with it will know that it was horrible. Essentially a tight fitting rubber bag with an oxygen mask fitted to it. And we worked quite closely with the guys at Coningsby in clearing that, particularly worrying about operating it in the kind of temperatures that people were going to experience in the Gulf. So some trials we ended up working very closely with the front line and very closely with the operational evaluation units. So we at Boscombe Down, we were typically at the developmental stage of flight testing, and then the operational stage of flight testing was typically carried out by the operational evaluation units. And particularly for systems testing, we worked very closely with the OEUs. So for performance and flying qualities, we tended to do that. For systems testing, so particularly on the F3, radar development. Huge amount of radar development done on the F3 to turn it from the old-fashioned blue circle concrete lump in the front through to, by the time we got to things like stage 2G radar, really a very powerful radar with data link, which made the F3 an incredibly effective air superiority fighter, because it's all about situational awareness, all about situational awareness. But to go from the early days of the F2 through to that standard of capability in the F3 took a lot of work, and it took a lot of working closely with BA Systems and with the front line.
And all our viewers know that the F3 is my favourite plane, so what was it actually like to fly? Yeah,
so I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, and I don't want to shatter any illusions here. The Tornado was never my favourite aeroplane. So I've flown a lot of aeroplanes, Mike. I don't know how many, I need to count them. Probably, I don't know, probably between 150 and 200. And I've flown a lot of combat aircraft, The F3 and the GR1 are both fairly big, heavy aircraft that, if I'm perfectly honest, don't really feel like fighters. Does that mean that they're not good at their job? No, of course not. Both very good at their job, particularly by the time the F3 got towards the end of its service life, with all the systems that it had, it was doing a fantastic job. And of course the GR1 and the GR4 have always done a great job. So I always found it a bit disappointing to fly as a pure fighter, because it doesn't feel like a fighter like an F-16 or an F-15 or a Su-27 or something like that. It doesn't feel like a fighter like they do. It feels a bit kind of like stirring jelly, in my opinion, and it's a big cockpit and. So, you know, I'd prefer to be in an F-16 if I'm perfectly honest.
But it must have been the quickest though.
It was. So one of the trials I got involved in on the F3, and by the way, when we test aeroplanes, we always think in three kind of categories. We think of performance, we think of handling qualities, so what's it like to fly, and we think of systems, so how good are the systems in the aircraft. From a performance point of view, the F3 was really pretty outstanding. I mean, I don't think I've flown a faster aircraft in a straight line. And I actually got involved in flying the high-speed clearances on the aircraft when it came into service. So part of that was I've actually had an F3 to 802 knots at 2,000 feet out over the Atlantic, out in the western approaches. My own dedicated tanker, which we were going back to every 5 minutes because we were getting through some gas. But we got the aeroplane to it, so the limit was 800, and I swear I saw 800 knots in the HUD. When they subsequently went through all of the flight test instrumentation, they said it was actually 802. I never saw that. I saw 800. I'm not going to admit to breaking a limit. But actually, when we got back to Boscombe Down, there were various bits of the aeroplane missing.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
Oh dear. Did you get in trouble for that?
No, because it was a trial. So
yeah,
and the bits that were missing were, I'm going to say minor bits. I'm sure they're important, but so the recesses where the Skyflash missiles go.
Ah, yes.
I'm going to say plastic. They're probably not. They're probably carbon fibre or something. I don't know. But anyway, bits of those had come off. The paint had all burnt off the base of the fin, and the material on the side of the fuselage where the wing sweeps into, much of that had gone as well.
And you mentioned a few of the American types there, so how many American types did you fly? The F-16? Did you get to fly the F-14?
I flew the F-14 at Point Magoo on a test pilot school student exercise, and we had to go to Oceana on the East Coast first to fly the simulator. So I've flown the F-14, I've flown the F-15 2 or 3 times, never flown an E. I'd like to fly an E, but I've flown the F-15, and I loved the F-15. Anybody that grew up on the Phantom loves the F-15, particularly the early models.
It's Big Brother, isn't it?
Big Brother. Yeah. Similar systems. If you're familiar with F4 systems, you're familiar with early F-15 systems. So it kind of felt like a Phantom, but with a wing, which was nice. So a Phantom with aerodynamics, got to be good. And I've flown the F-16 a number of times, the F-18 a number of times. That's probably it in terms of American types. But I've flown Mirage 2000. I was very lucky. In about 91 or 92, whichever year Farnborough was, got my hands on a flanker.
I was just about to ask you that. Tell us about that experience.
Yeah, it was superb. So myself and one of the other pilots on the squadron were sitting in Fast Jet Test Squadron at the time, and the boss, Nigel Wood, came in and said, you two are going off to Farnborough next week to fly a Su-27. And bearing in mind this is shortly after the end of the Cold War, we didn't know really anything about the aeroplane, apart from the grainy intelligence brief pictures that we'd seen towards the end of the Cold War. And the story was that Sukhoi were displaying the aircraft at Farnborough. They were interested in trying to market the aeroplane now that the Cold War had ended, market it internationally. And BAE Systems had been approached by Sukhoi to see if they would help them do that. And BAE Systems said, we'd like to fly the aeroplane then. And Sukhoi said yes. So BAE Systems then approached the Ministry of Defence and said, after the Farnborough Air Show's finished, we'd like to fly their aircraft. And the MOD said, you can do that, but 2 of our test pilots are going to fly it as well. Wow. So 4 of us actually ended up going down to Farnborough the following week. 2 BAE Systems guys and myself and a colleague from Boscombe Down. And we met Yevgeny Frolov, who was the Sukhoi test pilot, and I think Mr. Simonov, if my memory is correct, who was Sukhoi designer.
Okay.
And we had a series of briefs with them about flying the aeroplane. Interesting, because it was clear that their initial impression was that we were going to sit in the back and have a ride, and that was not our aim at all. Our aim was that all four of us were going to fly the aeroplane. We were going to fly it from the front, and we were going to do everything with a SU-27 that you could do with a SU-27, and then we were going to write reports. So between the four of us, we kind of came up with a test plan that did everything we could think of. Sukhoi agreed. We briefed. We had an interpreter. The Russians didn't speak English, the interpreter didn't speak any technical English, so by the time I climbed up into the front of the aeroplane to go fly, I really knew nothing about it. Yevgeny jumped in the back. He didn't really speak English. In fact, he didn't speak English. So although he was there, it ended up virtually being a solo trip. A testimony to the aeroplane, it was very, very easy from a start-up taxi, checks point of view, very, very easy. Everything colour-coded in the cockpit, so nothing really to remember. Airborne, completely carefree, don't worry about limits. The aircraft will look after itself, the engines will look after themselves. Coming from the Tornado, which is the world's biggest book of limits to memorise, it was a bit of a revelation actually, so very, very easy aeroplane to fly. And I was lucky because on my trip, the part of the test plan that I'd got was to go low flying down through Devon and Cornwall, assess the aeroplane at low level, and then pop up near Boscombe Down, meet up with Andy Young, who was airborne from Boscombe Down in a Hawk, and do some visual air combat with a Hawk. So we did some close formation, then we did some visual air combat. And bearing in mind the flanker is a really big, heavy aeroplane.
It's big.
I could not believe how quickly I was beating the Hawk in visual combat.
No way, really?
And you would not beat a Hawk in visual combat with a Tornado.
Wow.
Not in visual combat. In beyond visual range combat, obviously, but visual combat, close in, knife fight in a phone booth, you would not beat a Hawk. Flanker, I was beating him very easily, and it wasn't until I just took a couple of minutes, because the aeroplane was all in kilometres per hour in terms of speed.
Okay.
So when I did the mental conversions, I realised I was getting about 6G out of the aircraft at about 270 knots, which is a very small turn. And that's why I was beating it. And even to get 6G out of a Hawk, you'd probably need 400 knots. So very, very small turns. But just a delight to fly the aircraft. Not as fast as an F3, you'd be pleased to hear. I tried it at 2,000 feet to see how fast it would go. It was not as fast as an F3. But in terms of handling qualities and ease of operation, it was an absolute dream. I loved it. And we said to the designer afterwards, I'm sure his name was Mr. Frolov, we said to him afterwards, you've built a beautiful aeroplane that's very, very easy to fly. And he said it has to be easy to fly because our pilots get very, very few hours. So almost a design feature of the aircraft.
So you were honest with it, you weren't going to say it's rubbish, were you? Like, you were actually honest. So what were the engines like? Were they powerful?
Yeah, they were powerful. They were powerful, and like I said, they were carefree, so didn't have to worry about them. So I managed to ask Yevgeny in the back if he would show me his famous Cobra manoeuvre from the air show.
Yes.
So he did that, and you know, to trust engines to put up with that kind of abuse in terms of angle of attack and all the rest of it at low speed, at high power settings, is quite something. The engines didn't miss a beat.
And is that the Cobra manoeuvre actually useful in combat, or is it just a party trick?
People will have different opinions on that. My own view is it's a bit of a party trick, probably because of my background on the Phantom and then the Tornado. I'm a great believer in speed is life. I think once you get that slow in combat, your days are numbered, personally.
So Dave, do you have a favourite aircraft you've flown and tested?
Yeah, people often ask me that, and I'm going to give you a bit of a cheating answer, actually, Mike. So the answer is no, I don't, but here's why. So when you test an aircraft or you test a system, you can't just go test it. You have to test it within the context of what it's going to be used for.
Yes.
So there's an absolute classic example, which is for many years on the school down at Boscombe Down, we flew the Jaguar, and we had the Jaguar as a core aeroplane on the course. Now, you go and jump into a Jaguar and go fly a Jaguar, having flown any other fast jet, and you will say it is terrible. It's underpowered, it's got massive drag as soon as you start turning, and it's just really disappointing as a combat aircraft. So we converted people to the Jaguar at ETPS. We gave them a 2-sortie conversion to the aircraft, and they hated it. Almost universally they hated it. And then 3 weeks later, The first exercise we gave them to go and do on the Jaguar was the navigation system and the weapon system. And as part of that, they ended up flying the aeroplane low level around Devon and Cornwall, going to the range at Pembrey in Wales and dropping bombs. And then after that, you go, what do you think of the Jaguar? And they go, it is absolutely fantastic.
Oh, okay. Oh.
Because to go and fly the aeroplane at 10,000 feet and try and do aerobatics with it, or air combat manoeuvring, is terrible. Get the aeroplane into its environment, into what it was supposed to do as a low-level attack aircraft, it's really good. So almost no wing, very thin wing section, so it just doesn't see gusts. So really stable weapons platform. A pretty good weapons system for its time, very well integrated to the cockpit at the second attempt. The first attempt was pretty bad, but the second attempt, known as 1064, was a really good systems integration. You could fly along at low level, you could type into it without having to look into the cockpit. Relatively intuitive. As soon as people flew the aircraft in its intended role, they loved it. So I like aircraft for roles. So, you know, flying light aeroplanes, I love the CI Michetti 260. I absolutely love it. I think it's the nicest light aeroplane ever built. I absolutely love it. You know, combat aircraft, I probably love the F-15, just because it's a bit like a Phantom, but it actually flies properly. You know, the DC-3, I absolutely love the DC-3 because it's just classic. Yeah. You know, and the flight deck looks more like the bridge of a Victorian steamship, you know, with big black wheels and levers and big dials that are always in the red. I mean, it's just fantastic. And of course, climbing up into the back and then walking uphill to the flight deck. So I love all sorts of aeroplanes, but I love them for the jobs that they were supposed to do. I'll tell you the worst aeroplane I've ever flown. Uh-oh. Yeah, worst aeroplane I've ever flown is a thing called a Commonwealth Aircraft Boomerang, which is a World War II Australian-built fighter. So the story goes that the Australians were buying P-40s off the Americans because of the threat they had to the north of Australia. Pearl Harbor happened, the order was cancelled. The Australian government asked Commonwealth Aircraft to build a fighter, and they built this thing called the Boomerang. So one of my oldest friends in aviation, Jim Wally, he was a student of mine at ETPS in 1995. He subsequently started an extremely successful business in Australia, which I then, when I left the Air Force, started the European subsidiary of. But Jim found the wreck of a Boomerang in Australia. Wow. And the tail number of that aircraft was in his dad's logbook from World War II. So he had to buy the wreck, and he had to have it restored to airworthy condition. I don't know whether it's the only airworthy Boomerang. I did hear a rumour there was another one, I'm not sure, but anyway, Jim's got an airworthy Boomerang. He allowed me to fly it. It is utterly, utterly dreadful.
So if you're a fan of the Boomerang, maybe cut that bit out.
Yeah.
Just don't watch that bit. But you probably have a lot, but is there anything, a memorable story that sticks out in your mind from your time being a test pilot? All
sorts. How long have you got? I mean, if you need to get home tonight, you probably just getting me to talk about aeroplanes is dangerous, Mike. Yeah, all sorts, to be honest. So I've already mentioned the story of flying the flanker at Farnborough. That was just brilliant. Yeah. I mean, that's a once in a lifetime kind of thing. Later in my career, I was the MOD's chief test pilot. I had 3 test squadrons working for me at Boscombe Downs, so Fast Jet Test Squadron, Heavy Aircraft Test Squadron, Rotary Wing Test Squadron, and then the Test Pilot School, which was effectively the conversion unit for the test squadrons. We got involved in all sorts of stuff at that time that I'm pretty proud of. Not all of it was hands-on test flying for me, much of it was done by the guys on the squadrons. Okay. But that period was, it was when we were at our heaviest involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the work coming through was unbelievable. And much of that work that was being done very quickly as part of what's known as urgent operational requirements was then going through us, and then it was going straight out to be used operationally. So
very rewarding, I can imagine.
Very rewarding, very proud of a lot of that. The guys on the squadrons did fantastic work to get an awful lot of great capability out to the front line. Including things like getting the Reaper into RAF service, which was a, just a huge step forward in capability. All sorts of stories, but one that always sticks in my mind wasn't actually, I guess, test flying, but I got it because I was a test pilot. And that is that in 2011, I spent a year in Afghanistan. It was my second tour out there, but a year in Afghanistan, and the job was running the Coalition Air Operation and Theatre. So I was NATO's Director of Air Operations and Plans. So the job was kind of, running how are we going to support the ground operation to best effect with air power. Some of that obviously is combat air, but a lot of it is surveillance and reconnaissance. A lot of it is air transport. Even interesting things like how are we going to build an Afghan Air Force. That kind of thing we were engaged. So very, very varied job. But to be perfectly honest, the first 3 months I was out there, so kind of December through to February, March, we'd had a bit of trouble with the US Marines who kind of wanted to do their own thing rather than integrate with the rest of the airspace and integrate with the rest of the air operation. So in about March, no, the Marines are fiercely joint. So they don't need to work with the Air Force and the Army because they have all that in-house, so they kind of want to do things their way. This is US Marines, not Royal Marines, US Marines. So in about March 2011, we had a big swap over down at Camp Bastion of the US Marine Corps Air Wing. So I thought what I'll do is I'll go down and I'll meet the new US Marine Corps Marine Air Wing commander, see if I can get on with him, and see if we can sort this out. So I went from Kabul down to Bastion, met him at Camp Leatherneck, which was the US Marine Corps base. Turned out he was a test pilot. Helicopter test pilot. He'd been through the Navy test pilot school at Patuxent River in the US. Didn't actually know each other, but we knew all the same people. We had all the same kind of experience, so we immediately hit it off. Obviously no alcohol in theatre, so lots of coffee, but we had a really good chat over loads of cups of coffee. We sorted out all the airspace issues that we'd had, and then as I was leaving his office, he said, "Oh Dave, by the way, when you get to the end of your year in theatre, give me a ring, come and fly one of my Ospreys." So I said, okay. Didn't really think any more of it. I thought he was joking. Went back. 9 months later, getting to the end of my year, I rang him up and I said, "Hey Bluto, were you serious about this? Were you serious I could fly an Osprey?" He went, "Oh yes, get down here." So I went down to Bastion. He introduced me to one of his MV-22 squadron commanders. He gave me literally 10 minutes on how to fly an MV-22. We went out to the aircraft and he allowed me to fly this aircraft around Helmand for an hour, and it was just brilliant. And I have to say, it had been quite a difficult year, but to finish it that way, with effectively flying a 1 sortie, almost a test flight, on something as unique as an Osprey was absolutely fantastic. And I loved the aeroplane. I absolutely loved it.
So how many hours did you get in your, I guess, entire career, but also on your test career?
Not many is the answer. So you've probably heard this from fast jet pilots before, but we don't get hours at the rate that airline pilots get hours. So I've got a total of about 5,000 hours, and I'd say probably about just over 1,000 are frontline operational hours. The rest are a mixture of flight test and what I got when I was in flying training. So a lot of hours in flight test over the years.
Well, we've got a few personal questions if you're happy to answer these, Dave.
I'll see what they are.
So do you have any hobbies?
I do, yeah. So I enjoy keeping fit. And actually at my age I'm actually still flying commercially, so I'm still I do upset recovery training for airline pilots, which is now a big thing, and I still teach at test pilot school, and I also still do a bit of active test flying, so I have to keep passing medicals. So keeping fit is relatively important. So I enjoy running, I enjoy keeping fit. I've always enjoyed that. Another kind of hobby that I've had all through my life is music. So when I was at school and then university, believe it or not, I played the cello quite seriously. Took a diploma with the London College of Music, which is kind of where you go when you finished all the grades. So got quite a long way on the cello and the piano, but a bit further on the cello. And I've kept playing the cello on and off over the years. I love music. I love playing in orchestras, small thing. It's dropped off, if I'm honest, for the last few years because having been a businessman for 10 years, life's been a bit busy, but now I'm into semi-retirement. I've picked up the cello again. I'm actually having some lessons to try and get rid of all my bad habits that I've accrued over the years. So definitely getting back into music. And then the other thing I guess I've always enjoyed is riding motorbikes. So again, probably fairly stereotypical for a fighter pilot. But
I was going to say.
I got my first motorbike when I was 16, and I've had motorbikes throughout my life. So much to my wife's dismay, I still ride motorbikes.
This could be a difficult one or an easy one. Favourite aircraft you've flown?
Oh, favourite aircraft I've ever flown, my goodness. I think for the same reason as earlier, I don't know. So I think combat aircraft, probably the F-15.
Right.
Probably the F-15, although I have to say the Hawk probably comes close. I've always loved the Hawk. I think anybody that's flown the Hawk loves the Hawk. It's just glorious. It is just glorious. I mean, it's almost a viceless aeroplane, almost. It does have one or two things that'll catch you out if you're not careful, but it's almost a viceless aeroplane. Just a delight to fly.
Sports car, I've heard
a real little sports car, a real little sports car. So if anybody wants to buy me a Hawk, I'd be delighted. So
We'll
probably between the Hawk and the F-15, if I'm honest.
Brilliant. One you would love to fly, either past or present?
That's a good question. So I was really lucky. So I'd never flown a Spitfire, and I'd always want, because you have to fly a Spitfire. So I was very lucky that I retired from the company that I started when I left the Air Force, and the company very kindly bought me an hour in a Spitfire down with Spitfires.com, used to be Bolt B, flying out of Lyon Solent, and in fact one of our other company test pilots, Jim Schofield, is their chief pilot. So I flew with Jim, and because of my experience, he put me in the front, not the back. So I was actually able to fly the aeroplane myself, and he did actually also clear me solo. So I do want to go and fly a single-seater. The only problem is that most owners require 5 hours for insurance purposes. I've only got 1 hour, but he did clear me solo. So if anybody wants to let me fly the Spitfire, I'm there.
Here we go.
So I achieved that ambition in November last year. Finally, I was 60 years old at the time. I looked at my dad's logbook. He first flew a Spitfire when he was 20, so it took me a while to catch my dad up, but there we go. So I've done that now. I would love to fly a Corsair, an F4U Corsair. I've always loved the Corsair, and my dad in World War II got his hands on most US and British fighter types of the war. And he said his all-time favourite aircraft to fly was the Corsair, which is probably why I'd like to find out if he was right.
And can we find you online anywhere? Twitter, Instagram, anything like that?
Yes, I'm on Twitter. So I used to have a sheepdog called Ollie, who was just a fantastic dog. I've already said I'm a runner. Ollie as a sheepdog was a runner. We're lucky we live in the hills in Buckinghamshire, and Ollie and I used to go running, and my wife used to go running for hours. And Ollie had a Twitter account, which he was quite vocal on. He had opinions on most things. Ollie sadly left us just before his 15th birthday. But I've now hijacked his old Twitter account into an aviation account. So
going to be happy about that?
Ollie the Collie one. Ollie will be delighted about that. He did go flying once with me. He flew with my wife and I from here in a Piper Saratoga down to Newquay Airport. Yeah, and he quite enjoyed it.
Brilliant. Well, we'll link that in the description, folks. But Dave, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome, Mike. Lovely to talk to you.